Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme we'll be discussing what is the extent that we are losing our Christian freedoms in the UK and why Christian freedoms are so essential to the functioning of a healthy democracy. And in this programme today I'm joined by Ryan Christopher, who is the Director of ADF International UK, stands for Alliance Defending Freedom. The perfect guy to discuss the state of our Christian freedoms in this country. So welcome to the programme, Ryan.
Thanks, Simon.
Pleasure. And Ryan, do you just want to share something about your background, how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and how he's led you down a kind of political, legal path really to do a wonderful job in defending the Christian freedoms that we have or have left in this country?
Yeah, very happy to, Simon. When I was around the age of 10 or 11, I come from an only child, single mother household, sadly. And when I was about the age of 11, my mother came back to faith, fairly out of the blue for me, age 10 or so. And it was a really strong reversion to her faith. And despite some rocky patches, ever since then, really, I've believed. I'm really grateful to say there's been an extraordinary outpouring of grace at certain times in my life where that was under threat, I now see in retrospect. And with regards to this work, it came from doing a lot of pro bono work on equality legislation, in particular connection to abortion. So for a few years, I'd done some strategic work, some speech writing, some thinking around parliamentary bills to do with the sanctity of life and the equality of boys and girls in the womb, or the equality of the disabled and non-disabled in the womb too.
And share what it's like to actually work in Parliament and actually to help members of Parliament or members of the House of Lords drafting up their speeches, to actually be involved in helping to draft kind of legislation as well that actually protects the unborn, which is so important in this country.
It's a really extremely busy, intense work to do. The hours are crazy, Monday to Wednesday, so as viewers might know, Monday to Wednesday, you have really, really extreme, intense activity around Westminster from very early in the morning to very late at night. And then MPs tend to go back on Wednesday night or Thursday to the constituencies to work hard there too. And the one thing I would say, Simon, is I know MPs sometimes rightly get a hard rep, but the one thing that really strikes you working there, particularly with good Christian MPs, right, many of those that would be familiar to your viewers, is just how faithful, just how hardworking, just how much integrity, just how well formed, just how prayerful these people are. And it really is a sacrificial life to live, I think, particularly if you have a family, to be an MP and to try and witness to Christian truths in that context. It's quite exciting to be involved with. I think when you're new to that work in particular, the idea that you would write a speech that goes down in Hansard and that goes down in history, or you might be able to amend a bill that saves some lives, literally saves lives. That's an extraordinary privilege to have, and it's really important that those that do our work don't bear that lightly, because not only are sometimes lives on the line or Christian freedoms on the line, but the reputation of MPs themselves are on the line. They have to be able to rely on the briefing that you're giving them. If you're helping them write a speech, they have to be able to say something with confidence that they're not going to look stupid. Because if you start to get those things wrong, they simply won't use you again. So accuracy is extremely important in this line of work.
You shared an interesting story with me before we start the programme, so I'm sure our viewers are going to love this as well. But share with us how you worked on Fiona Bruce's amendment bill to an abortion legislation and how you nearly turned over a key legislation affecting abortion in this country.
Can't talk about that one publicly, sorry.
Okay, we'll move on. Yeah. So when you're retired, come back in a few years' time
exactly.
and let us know.
That's one of the quiet things we've done. Yeah.
No worries, but no, appreciate the kind of work you do and stuff as well. But can you share with us now your new role as the UK Director of ADF, which stands for Alliance for Defending Freedom. What is this ministry and what is your kind of legal and political remit?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So Alliance Defending Freedom, we're a Christian legal advocacy organisation. And what do I mean by legal advocacy? That kind of works in two channels. Firstly, strategic legal cases. So where there's a fundamental freedom at stake, particularly with regards to people being able to live out or speak the truth, then we're looking to take cases that will set good precedents in law. So often that means saying no a lot, and sadly, to individual situations, but very carefully selecting cases where there's likelihood we'll win, and there's a likelihood that that precedent will protect Christian freedoms. The second area that applies to legal advocacy is around policy work, around with the government and with parliamentarians too. And actually, an awful lot of our work is with government departments and officials, because although constitutionally Parliament is sovereign in lots of ways, what you find in practice is that it's often civil servants and government departments that actually are the key places to work in order to influence policy. Whether that's constitutionally balanced rightly or not is another question, but that's the reality. So legal advocacy is the heart of what we do in a day-by-day way, and we do that from Westminster itself. And in addition, we do an awful lot of training of young professionals, so specific tracks for lawyers under the Blackstone programme, and for young professionals more generally under our Arete training programmes. And those programs are for Christians who want to change law and culture. It's not, I'm a Christian and I would like to be better educated in politics. It's no, you as an individual already feel called to change things, in which case come to us, we'll train you up.
Fantastic. And share with us the relationship you have with your American counterparts in the States, the ADF International in the States, and the remit they do, and how much guidance and help that they give you to help defend Christian freedoms in this country.
Yeah, we're really proud to work with our American colleagues at ADF in the USA. And of course, it was in the USA that our organization was founded over 20 years ago. But one of the things that is really incredible about our US colleagues is, despite their great victories in the US, despite the amazing professionalism and work that they do over there, they largely leave us to have our own remit here in the UK. So whilst we're partners and we share strategic purposes, we're a UK charity with UK trustees, and our UK team are focused on, most of the time, things that affect people in the UK, because our US colleagues recognize that we have the knowledge about the local threats. Now, that doesn't mean we're siloed. Whether it be our international colleagues across the continent, or whether it be our colleagues in the USA, there are fundamental freedoms that we share that we're looking to protect, and there are generational victories that we're looking to achieve together as one organization in that sense. So issues like life being protected, or defense of the natural family structure, or religious liberty, these are shared strategic ends, despite us being given an awful lot of autonomy in our regional offices.
Now, for someone who's working on the front lines defending Christian freedom in this country, what would you say are the state of religious freedom in this country under the current Conservative government? Yeah,
I think if we were to start, going right back, we aren't in a time of martyrdom like many Christians have in other parts of the world. So it's very easy to begin with, aren't things terrible for us? Well, from a biblical perspective and from a rest of the world perspective, things are very good. So I think you have to start by recognizing that. But there's no doubt we're in a time of white martyrdom, right? And a bloodless martyrdom in that sense, for lots of people in terms of reputation, career, stress, and fear. There's no doubt that there's increasing tension between some fundamental freedoms that Christians would hold and the zeitgeist. Things are getting worse. There's no doubt about that in my mind.
And what do you think is the main cause of this? Is it being driven by our mainstream media? Is this being driven from academics from our universities? Is this being driven by a kind of progressive agenda within Parliament? Because it seems very much that our nation and its institutions, including the Church of England and the Archbishop of Canterbury, have completely abandoned our Judeo-Christian heritage and are embracing what can only be described as this extreme liberal progressive agenda that would trample over everything to do with kind of religious freedom, or its intention is to destroy as much religious freedom that we have in this country and only accept one viewpoint, and that is of this progressive liberal left.
You've used two words there together, liberal and progressive, and I think they're slightly different, and this is partly the answer. I think there's a bit of a vacuum right now about where we go as a society, right? So we've had what was supposed to be a liberal era, a live and let live era, a multicultural, multi-belief kind of era, post-World War II, for example. So most of the human rights that we enjoy under law come from that period where that was designed to be protected. But the liberal era is dying, and we're in this kind of strange crossover time between the live and let live liberal era, which is founded on Christian laws with Christian assumptions behind them and Christian freedoms underpinning them, to a time of progressivism and radical secularization for its own sake, I think. And within that transition period that we're in, progressivism increasingly looks illiberal. And so in that vacuum, you've got particular new, I would call them secular dogmas, starting to be formed. Like, societies are always going to be hierarchical to some degree. We're always going to be religious to some degree. We're always going to want to tend towards truths, good and bad. Are you in or out? That's the way human beings have kind of operated since the fall, right? These new secular dogmas are increasingly being protected by primary legislation or enforced by primary legislation, regulation, and then that means HR departments, and it means media outlets, and it then becomes a social view that your mates down the pub feel like they have to hold, and that's how culture changes. So I do think we're in a time of vacuum where very, very intentional minority lobby groups can actually have an oversized impact on the culture and the ability of Christians to live out and speak the truth.
That's a great explanation, so I appreciate that one as well. But Ryan, can you just share with us, how is this affecting your ordinary Christian in the workplace? Their ability to express their faith in Jesus Christ, their desire to share the gospel, but even to pray for their colleagues, or if they're in trouble, if they're in bad health, and finding that they have the full force of the law going against them.
Yeah, I think an awful lot of Christians feel like they lack the confidence to know what to do in the workplace, and therefore they're going to be quiet. And if I could give one headline to Christians watching this, it's to say, no, have confidence to express your faith in reasonable terms, whenever it might be reasonably appropriate. Honestly, the law, the primary legislation that we have, particularly things like the Equality Act, are designed to protect your right to do that. Our human rights are designed to protect your right to religious expression. I think there's a danger that as Christians, we draw the boundaries of acceptable speech and behavior in on ourselves. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you're a Christian that never talks about the fact that you pray at work, ever, you never drop it in. You don't even say, oh, I went to church on Sunday, I prayed on Sunday, or I was praying about that thing. To use language about prayer or going to church over time becomes extreme, right? It's de facto becomes extreme language. And so I do think, despite laws and regulations that we can talk about getting worse for Christians, I think an awful lot about the culture that we live and work in, we can control. Let's not disempower ourselves as to what acceptable speech and behavior looks like around us, as long as it's reasonable, done in charity, with love, etc.
Ryan, just share with us your thoughts on the kind of public expression of our faith, the likes of street preachers, for example. Those wanting to protest outside abortion clinics now have to be in a kind of buffer zone and a long way from these abortion clinics. Also, the problem of many prospective members of parliament that hold biblical beliefs and hold dear to the Bible and our Christian faith are essentially being deselected because they won't sign up to this progressive agenda.
Yeah, I think the key problem with the public square, public expression of Christianity, is primary legislation that is really fuzzy in its definition. And when you create bad laws that are fuzzy in definition, you give great power to those that are enforcing that law. So it creates confusion for the Christian. Can I or can I not express this thing in this way? And so you get this chilling effect on things like street preaching or even conversation in the street or online. And then when it comes to enforcement, enforcement is going to go with where the zeitgeist is rather than with where the line in the law is, if they're unsure and that law itself isn't clear in its definitions. So I'll give an example. With street preaching, we have public order law that says it's only abusive language that should be criminalised. But the Crown Prosecution Service, when it comes to look at incidents, says, in effect, if people are insulted, it's likely to be abuse within the law. And so what does that mean for the police? That means for the police, if they're listening to something that you say, quoting from the Bible, preaching on the back of that quote from the Bible, if someone in the general public says they're deeply offended or insulted, it's likely the police officer is going to say, you know what, under the guidance, that means I should arrest this person. That's often where the problems come, that really broad laws with guidance that is unhelpful and gives far too much power and far too much unfair responsibility to enforcement agents as well. It's not fair on the police that they're stuck in that position of trying to interpret every single situation without that clarity that the law should give. So fuzzy laws, now some of these laws are being purposefully framed to be fuzzy, like the recent Clause 11 of the Public Order Bill that set up buffer zones. The language there is to criminalise people influencing each other in the street. And that's specifically put there by those that drafted the clause to completely shut down behaviour or presence that they don't approve of.
And even the being prosecuted for actually praying, not even praying, uttering prayers, where people can hear, but
yes.
but prosecuting people for kind of thought police, essentially, prayers that are saying in people's heads, where they can't even hear it or actually have any evidence against them that are even praying. Yeah. So just show the ridiculous state that our government has got itself involved in, being beholden to these abortion sponsors.
I think there's a general issue behind this where, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like 20 years ago, a law that would criminalise influence in and of itself, even if people were pro-abortion in the House, would have said, hang on a minute, that's really bad law. That's really unclear. Let's not pass that. Like your intent, I believe in buffer zones, but that's just bad law. We don't see that very much now in the House. And instead we tend to see legislators more focused on the virtue signal as part of the bill rather than how the bill's actually going to work in practice. And so, it leads to absurd laws, or unclear laws lead to absurd results where Isabel Vaughan Spruce is being arrested in the street by 6 police officers who are searching her, including her hair, like she's a terrorist, because she's prayed silently in the privacy of her own mind when the abortion facility is closed and there's no one around. I mean, this is clearly absurd stuff. And as you say, it is thought crime too, because she could have prayed about animal welfare or her family, and she would not have been arrested. It was only on being examined by the police as to the nature of her prayer, the content of her prayer in her own mind being related to abortion, that they then arrested her. So that risks being viewpoint discrimination, and it also risks thought crime too, which is extraordinary. And again, if any incident proves that we're in that post-liberal moment, that live and let live moment, then I think her arrest is it.
No, absolutely, and I think this is very disturbing and also very, very dangerous for anyone wanting to interpret that law and bring about that law. Ryan, I have to ask you about your thoughts on the government's Prevent scheme that was originally set up to counter Islamic extremism, Islamic terrorism. This was the biggest threat facing the West, particularly after the aftermath of 9/11 and then 7/7, the London terrorist attacks here in 2005. But now we're seeing that legislation could be used to target Christians. Share with us the concern of the overreach of government regarding the practice of Christianity in this country, where the opponents of Christianity can use this legislation to bring prosecution against Christians. Yeah,
I think that the general concern with extremism is always most likely to impact religious practice that is not extreme, ultimately. And I think there's a kind of naivety often with schemes like some of the extremism regulation we've had and things like Prevent, that you will be able to regulate and monitor extreme behaviours out of society, whereas in fact you tend to, I don't know, let's say an illegal school of some kind. Parents who are really religiously committed, like Islamic parents, for example, to having an illegal school or illegal formation for their children, are just going to do it in another way. And then what you often find with this kind of regulation is that a Sunday school gets covered by it, unintentionally, albeit, but actually the Sunday school finds itself as an out-of-school setting potentially under threat for being regulated by something like Ofsted in the future. And the cultural values being taught by Christians in a Sunday school are being shut down or being affected because of legislation that was designed to solve a problem that it generally can't a lot of the time, actually.
So we need a lot of kind of wise wisdom from our members of parliament to see what's going on and the consequences of this legislation. But is it intentional or is it kind of accidental? A lot of these legislation being produced by Parliament that is having a deep impact upon our Christian freedoms in this country.
My experience is you have small lobbies who really want to remove religion from society, and certain small lobbies that would love to completely eradicate Christianity in particular from society. So I would never deny that isn't a part of some of these laws and regulations that passed in the time that I've been involved with Parliament and government. Definitely the case, right? The humanists and secular society are quite clear about what they want to achieve in that sense. However, most of it actually is a result of religious illiteracy, and in particular, I think a real hubris about assuming that people understand what Christianity is, how it works, what it teaches, what that means for society, when in fact people don't understand that in the heart of government. And there have been several reports that have been released, including the Trudeau report about the Foreign Office as one example, that have concluded there is a deep, deep need for civil servants to understand religion better in doing their jobs on behalf of society. So I would say the key reason we see a lot of this is a lack of joined up thinking combined with religious illiteracy. And then, of course, you have particular lobby groups who would like to see the eradication of Christianity and religion more generally too.
Yeah, and can you just share with us, particularly Christians who are concerned about the growing impact of critical race theory on the workplace and having to sign up to a pledge to support the BLM on Black Lives Matter, and of course Black Lives do matter, but what we are concerned about is the Marxist far left agenda that is actually behind this movement.
I think the key for Christians is to be as positive as they can, to show that they believe in diversity and inclusion in a way that is Christian compatible. And of course, different Christians are going to cut that different ways from different traditions, right? Absolutely. But I think the start point is to be positive and say, hey, whatever it looks like, I believe in equality. I believe in Imago Dei. I believe that everyone has inherent dignity and worth and is lovable. But that doesn't mean that I have to be part of a political message. And I think it's really important for Christians to separate out political message from that belief in the equality and value of each individual person. Now, when it comes to having to sign up to things or accept certain things, if it's critical race theory, that's something where if you're being forced to sign up to something by your employer, it risks being kind of compelled speech and expression, frankly. And we've seen recent case law say to employers that actually you can't compel your employees into overtly political expression. The Ashes case is a great example of that kind of judgment.
Also, when it comes down to issues relating to Christians in the profession, and we can particularly look to the kind of medical profession, where we look at the kind of freedom of conscience to carry out an operation or not to carry out an operation, because there's that clash, as it were. What are your thoughts on really how to protect and defend freedom of conscience in the workplace, which is increasingly being challenged? Yeah,
I think we have, just like we have a general crisis about being able to positively explain why freedom's good in society right now, we have a real issue being able to explain to each other why freedom of conscience is particularly important. And freedom of conscience, obviously, from a Christian point of view, is a lot easier to understand, but there's a secular value to this too. Who wants a doctor that isn't intentional about their practice ethically? Like, that's clearly a better doctor. Who wants people in society to not have thought about their moral rights and wrongs? We want to encourage the maximal freedom for people to think through and then act upon what they believe to be inherently good or evil, right? But there's a crisis in that, and we see it in the law too. And for Christians who are pro-life in particular, this is a problem right now. So the Abortion Act 1967 gave specific freedom of conscience provision to doctors to opt out entirely out of the process. And what we saw from a big case called Dugan is that protection narrowed, so that Christian doctors, midwives, can't necessarily opt out from the whole process that would lead up to an abortion. There needs to be primary legislation to fix that. And in fact, Baroness O'Lone brought a private member's bill a few years ago that failed to try and reverse that change in the law. More problematically, whilst on the issue of life explicitly, at least there is some explicit protection under the law, when it comes to things like hormone treatment, for example, this is a grey area that I think a lot of Christian doctors are struggling with, because there is general guidance about conscientious objection from the GMC and other regulatory bodies. But there isn't really law that explicitly protects a medical professional's right to opt out of, for example, providing hormones to a 17-year-old girl that believes she's a boy and that might sterilize her for life. I, as a doctor, would never do that. I'd rather lose my job. And I know that many medical professionals find themselves in that situation. And so there needs to be a much clearer line drawn to protect that freedom, that core freedom, the freedom of conscience.
Ryan, you've given a superb interview. I very much enjoyed it, and it's been fascinating. But for our viewers watching, how can they get behind the great work being done by you and your team at ADF UK?
Thank you. Check out the website. Most of all, just pray for us, please. Working in this arena is very spiritually, psychologically exhausting, as you can imagine. So please pray for the advocates that work on your behalf.
Ryan, thank you so much for being my guest on this week's Politics Day. And I want to thank you for watching this programme at home. Yeah, really got to support Ryan and his team for the excellent work they are doing in defending our Christian freedoms. And we've all got to play our part to defend our Christian nation. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.